Hello everyone, this is Gilbert Gelada again from CPLSPA headquarters. This is Tufts on Tax, where all your tax answers are here with Mr. T. Scott Tufts. You can call him at any time at 877-647-7887. Again, that's 877-647-7887, or you can email him at any time at stufts@cplspa.com. That's stufts@cplspa.com. And we have a great show for you today. Hello, Scott. How are you?
It's good to be with you.
Good to be with you, too. And today we have a special subject. And I wanted to ask you, actually, we're going to go through this. What is operating agreements? So we can explain to our listeners and viewers.
Yes, great opportunity today. An operating agreement is an agreement that is associated with limited liability companies. And with that, and we unpack that, it's going to get interesting. So essentially, it's the contractual arrangement for LLCs and describes their operations.
Oh, LLC. So what is an LLC? So we can explain?
Yeah, so this gets interesting. A limited liability company is something that we've had about 3 decades now, originated in Florida and Wyoming. But what they are is a hybrid. Think of metrics and inches. Remember when we used to have inches, and then metrics was going to kind of bring it all together, make it more simple or better? Well, LLCs came out of an effort to come up with an entity that brought the best of corporations and partnerships together into a better, more flexible, and ultimately providing flexibility and a great tax vehicle. So, and of course, limited liability. So when you see the LLC, limited liability company, it's not a corporation. Now, folks will get confused and they'll say, oh, it's a corporation, limited liability corporation. You even see that in judges' decisions. But technically, if all the statutes that I'm aware of, it's a limited liability company, and it's distinguishable from a corporation, distinguishable from a partnership. So when you're kind of thinking, well, what kind of business do I want to be? Your menu, like you're at a restaurant, is, do I want to be a corporation? Do I want to be an LLC, or do I want to be a partnership? Because partnerships have some limited liability protection now. You could be a limited partnership, or a limited liability partnership, or a limited liability limited partnership. So lots of choices here in Florida and other states. So the main thing is this liability protection folks like. But anyway, yes, LLC is what is associated with an operating agreement. Just as an aside, corporations might have a shareholders agreement and bylaws. Those are its governing documents, and partnerships would have a partnership agreement. So that's how they all compare.
So a question here, what determines? How do you decide?
Well, okay. So how do you decide what to order at a restaurant, Gilbert?
That's a good question.
Right? Like, there are ingredients.
Of course.
They might have a personal taste.
What do you feel like?
It might be more expensive, right?
Yeah.
Do you go cheap? Do you want the little appetizer? Do you want the full-blown meal, right? And then who's all involved? Are you going to share your selection with, someone? So is there someone else involved, and is it messy? So the menu choices are actually, Gilbert, filled with all kinds of sub-issues there. Personal taste, cost, taxes. See, that's what we do here at Tufts on Tax. We're gonna unpack that. So we'll get into it.
So we talked about LLC. What about corporation? And there's S corporation.
Yeah. So for folks who kind of run around, in our society today, we're running around fast, right? We want a quick decision. Tell me what I need to do. Click a box, and we're on our way, right? So. Yes. The S corporation, or the S election, is something that has been a mainstay for corporate environment for years. So you're a corporation, right? And you don't want to separately pay taxes. You can make an S election, and its activities through a K1 are brought down to the ownership level. Does that make sense? So yes, it files a separate S corporation tax return, but its activities flow through to the owners, and that vehicle is the K1. Something we've been talking a lot about on with Tufts on Tax and the K1 and the issues that come with that. So S corporations are and it's often closely held because S corporations everyone can't have one. For example, if you're a foreign national, you cannot own an interest in an S corp. It would disqualify the S corporation. So you would not be eligible to be an S corporation. So when we use that term, it's a tax term, but it's of interest here. And we can get into that because the next question for that then, Gilbert, is this is where folks get really confused, and I hope we don't lose our listeners on this, but LLCs can make an election. The owners for an LLC can make an election to have the LLC treated for federal tax purposes as an S corporation.
Oh, wow. How is that?
So it creates a schism or a kind of like, wow, right? So I can think of the end of the name. So let's say we're Gilbert and Scott LLC, right?
Okay.
We also could be Gilbert and Scott Inc., right?
Correct.
Now, you see those initials. The Inc. is a term associated with corporations.
Correct.
And the LLC is, of course, LLCs. But either one of those entities can make an S election. So what you're going to, but see, what happens is if the operating agreement goes with an LLC, how do you prepare it? Remember we were talking about ingredients on a menu?
Correct.
What's in that operating agreement? Well, it will have to change its terms if it's an S corporation than if it's not an S corporation. Okay? So critical issue, right? And whether you're an S corporation or not by election, it's a form you file with the IRS, Form 2553. You then have to make that decision with good consultation with a CPA and thinking through what you want to be. No different than when you sit at a restaurant and decide what you want to eat, Gilbert.
Going back, I don't want to shift off the subject here. We talked about operating agreement. Now, going back to this, of course, it's all related with the taxes. Who needs one, and why do I need one?
Okay. So operating agreement as a definition can be oral or written. So let's think about that. Can you and I agree to do business and decide how we're going to do that and never write it down? What do you think?
No, absolutely not. Not nowadays.
Well, that's a decision, right?
Yes.
Let's say we never get around to putting it in writing, but we have oral understanding and we operate as an oral partnership for 2-3 years.
Yeah.
And then we get into dispute. We walk into court. What's going to happen?
A disaster.
Okay, but I'm going to say the partnership agreement was, and I'll tell you what our deal was. Correct. And you might say, no, our deal was something different. Correct?
Yeah.
Now, if we have an agreement, in that case, let's say we were a partnership, we would have a partnership agreement in writing. Maybe we get it to cover all the bases, and now we sign it. Now we walk into court. Am I going to do very well by saying, yeah, I know that's what it's written, and I know that's what we said. I mean, I know that's what we signed, but it's something totally different.
No, you can't.
That's not going to do so well, right?
You have to go by what you signed.
Same thing with an operating agreement for LLCs. If we have more than one owner in an LLC, and we're describing what's going on, another thing to think about is, let's say we hire employees, and we have an LLC.
Now it gets more complicated.
Right, and let's say we have someone that we want to kind of turn the day-to-day operations over to, like a president. In the LLC, they're called managers. Let's say we hire a manager, and you're the manager, and you want to know how the thing operates. You might look at an operating agreement to describe what its functions are and what your duties are. You see what I'm saying? Like if you're an officer in a corporation, and you need to know how you're elected and how you get to be the president or vice president, you go to the bylaws. So again, all of this comes down to what do you look up at? What is the governing document that tells you how you're elected or appointed, how you operate, what your duties are? You see what I'm talking about? So LLCs have the same thing, and it's called an operating agreement.
And how are I know you explained a little bit, but how are the taxes impacted when it comes to that, when let's say we're in that mess?
Right. So if you're kind of thinking this through, an operating agreement and the LLC and the complexity, do we have much complexity if I'm the only owner and it's my LLC and I'm the only one there?
Not so much, no.
Unless I disagree with myself, which can happen, but it's still not likely to be as much of an issue.
Does that happen often?
Well, let's hope not. But well, yes, it does. No, it doesn't.
No.
Okay, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I got
you. But the idea being that it really comes down to who's involved in the business, right?
Correct.
So if you have more than one person, now you're into a situation where what we're describing needs to be in writing and needs to be clear. Okay?
Yes, absolutely.
But even if I'm the only game in town, even if it's only my LLC, think about this, Gilbert. What happens if I get disabled and someone needs to step into my shoes and operate the business?
And you have nothing in writing.
I have nothing in writing. So even we call it, even a single member LLC, right, might need to have succession plans for the manager level to help someone know, hey, you could run the business if I am temporarily disabled or unable to run the business, then maybe I can have a backup. And in fact, that's quite prudent, right, to have kind of a successor role to step in if I'm not able to do it, right?
So that goes back to everyone needs one.
Yeah, I think everyone needs one. I think, the sum total today is, what is an operating agreement? Oh, it's a written agreement that describes how an LLC is going to operate. It's going to have all kinds of things in it, and you need to have it in writing, and you need to do that because without it, all kinds of problems can be created. And here's the other thing. In Florida and some states, you can actually enter into the operating agreement and have it be effective upon formation. So
what does that mean?
Okay, so how do you get started? How does an LLC or business get started and come to life? Does it just happen because you go?
No, of course.
How does it happen?
Not.
You go to the Secretary of State, you file some form called Articles of Organization with the LLC, Articles of Incorporation for corporations. When that happens, it's official, right? So the prudent thing to do is if you're going to go into business with someone, right, or you want to have this in place, would be to get that operating agreement figured out before you bring life to the entity. Make sense?
Absolutely.
Because
it
then,
does.
right after you form the entity, you've got this tax election thing we were talking about, S corp versus LLC, operating. Because if you haven't thought all that through, then you're going to have that issue to come up with at tax time.
So you have to determine and know where you're heading.
Yeah,
from the start.
And yes, things can change. So you can change from an S corp to another entity, although which way you go can matter. But if you're going to be a wholly owned single member LLC, and you do not make this election to be an S corporation, then it's going to be treated on your own taxes, just like a proprietorship. So it would come back to your 1040 and your Schedule C. So many of our listeners will know if you're a sole proprietor and you don't have an Inc. and you don't incorporate as an LLC, then you operate in the kind of Schedule C world where it just shows up on your taxes, like DBA, right? I do business as, XYZ. So you can do that. But once you incorporate and seek to have this limited liability protection and kind of create a separate person or entity, then that's where all this comes in. And yes, the taxes are very important to that issue.
Do people fall into this a lot, even recently?
Yeah, so what we're seeing, and this is kind of why I want to get the word out, I have folks tell me or give me the impression that these tax issues only need to be addressed if a dispute comes up, right? Actually, it's the other way around, because what we're seeing is the court cases are actually now unpacking an issue. Like, for example, let me just give you one example. The Delaware court recently, the Chancery Court there, had to deal with a situation where two people who were living together had an LLC that was only getting reported on one of their Schedule Cs as if they owned it. And then they came to blows or disagreement, and they asserted that they were really a 50-50 deal.
Oh, wow.
And they didn't have anything in writing. So guess what happened? In the court, they actually were looking at the tax returns, the Form 1040 for the one person. Then they brought the accountant in and said, did you know anything about this other person? Because if you did, why didn't you put it down as a 1065 partnership return 50-50?
Exactly.
See how that would come out? So basically, Gilbert, you and I, it would be as if, okay, Gilbert, we set up the Gilbert and Scott LLC, right? But instead of treating it as 50-50, you and me, with 2 K1s coming out, right, to each you and me, what would happen if I just put it on my Schedule C and say I know it says Gilbert and Scott, but Gilbert's really not involved. And I'm going to put it on my Schedule C as my business, 100%. And then we come to blows, and then you say, I own 50%, and let's say we have something valuable in it. You say, I want half. I'll say, well, you don't get half. It's mine. How would you prove otherwise? You say, well, I put up half the money. Or I put up all the money. You were sweat equity. I put up the money. And then I say, no, you didn't. It was a loan. And I say, where's your paperwork? I never promised to pay it back. See? And so you see how it starts to unpack.
Wow.
And basically, I would ask all of our listeners, if you're in a LLC or in a business of any kind that you have a dispute, what are your papers that prove what you think is true, right? Wouldn't that be the right way to think about it, Gilbert?
Yeah,
what would you
absolutely.
take into court or into a lawyer's office or even to the accountant and say, here's what proves I am what I think I am, or we are what we think we are?
You need that proof.
Yep.
Always.
And and let me finish up this way, Gilbert, by talking about one of the big things that we're focusing on Tufts on Tax is these forms, right?
Yeah.
And with this LLC, we're going to kind of get back to the K1, whether it's an S corp or not. And at the end of the day, we want to have a K1 when we have more than one owner properly describe what each of us own and have in the business. You see that? And if we don't have that K1, the question I want our listeners to know is, why don't you? Because what many of our listeners don't know, the accountants don't know, and the lawyers out there don't know, is that if you haven't gotten a K1 and you should have, you need to use the 808-2 form and say, well, here's what I think should have been on that K1, and you need to file it. So the news flash out there is, when you think K1, you think 808-2. It's the other side of a K1, and the 808-2 describes what's not right in the four corners of that K1. And you have an obligation to do that. So listeners out there, if you do not get a K1 and you should have, or the K1's wrong in any way, shape, or form within the four corners of that document, you have to step up and take action immediately, or you face the possibility that you might be stopped, a legal term, because you went along and we're okay with it for many years. So that's a huge lesson.
Well, that's thank you for that. I mean, I'm sure we will discuss this even further.
Yeah. So where we go from here, Gilbert, in future episodes, what we're going to be talking to folks about is we're going to unpack all of these forms and get back into the forms and see what the current climate is looking like for our topics. And our topics, as we get into them, will be disgruntled workers, where we worry about the SS8 and the W2 and all that stuff. Or we're going to talk about the international world, where we have the Form 3520, or we have the Forms 5471 that describe international relationships. We also are going to have a segment on cryptocurrency, virtual currencies, which is very important. A tax form has a question, yes or no, are you trading in virtual currency? You have to answer yes if you've got any of the Bitcoin or any of that stuff going on. And then we have other segments. We have an abusive tax shelter, where something that is very elaborate says you're going to save a lot of taxes. It just seems too good to be true. And then last but not least, we're going to have the K1 segments that focus on K1 issues and the 808-2 and that kind of thing. So it's a great opportunity for us to get into all this and help our listeners understand how these forms impact daily lives.
And we went through them briefly, but we'll get into more explanations in the future segment by segment, of course. Yep. Well, there you go, folks. If you have any questions for T. Scott Tufts, you can call him at 877-647-7887. Again, 877-647-7887. If you're watching our YouTube channel, the email and the phone number will be on the bottom of the screen. Again, you can email him at stufts@cplspa.com. That's stufts@cplspa.com. You can answer all your questions regarding lawsuits with IRS, with businesses, with friends, family, employees, anything you could think of, any troubles that you have with taxes, you can call and ask T. Scott Tufts, because he's the expert in this practice. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.